Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of The Liquid Culture with me, Mitchell Chirac. Today's episode is all about coffee. It's the carryover from my dry January series where I was focusing on some non-alcoholic things, but things that absolutely are still of massive interest to me and are things that very easily can be geeked out on, just as much so in the way of terroir, varietal, flavor profiles, and all that kind of fun stuff. So today we'll be covering a couple of things as it relates to coffee. Talk just a little bit about really kind of what coffee is, kind of where it comes from, how it kind of relates in a way to things like grape growing. We'll talk about processes that that the coffee goes through to get from that kind of plant into your cup, and how that can affect the difference in your overall flavor. We'll talk about some different brewing methods, and then ultimately I'll have a couple of coffees here that I've brewed up from my friends over at Apex, and we'll talk about some of the flavor differences and stuff like that. So it's going to be a fun episode, guys, so stick around.
The Liquid Culture.
To get started, let's kind of work our way to the origins of coffee a little bit. So when we're talking about coffee, really the world of coffee, much like the world of anything like grapes or we could say any type of fruit or plant or nut, really is a very broad and vast world. But when we're trying to break it down, we're going to start, of course, in that kind of genus, family, phylum, class, order, all that kind of good stuff. We're working in the Coffea Coffea genus. This species, then when we're talking about kind of specialty coffee, what we're really wanting to hone in and focus on is the Arabica species. When it comes to coffee, there are many species out there, and really Arabica is what you're going to see most when you're thinking of kind of third wave specialty coffee. Pretty much always going to be in that Arabica species, but you also can see from time to time things like the Robusta species, which is much higher in caffeine. It leads to a more bitter tasting coffee. It really is more of just a way to get that real strong caffeine buzz, but not really enjoy what's in your cup necessarily. Under the Arabica species, we have thousands and thousands of various varieties. So much like with grapes, we have, Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Carignan, Sangiovese. You've got many varietals of coffee that are spread all across the world. Coffee actually evolved in Ethiopia, in Africa. So Ethiopia is really considered kind of the homeland of coffee. From Ethiopia, it was transported all over the world, but really mostly to what we've found over the years is that coffee really seems to thrive best on countries that fall along the equator. Really kind of in that 20th to 20th parallel is really where you see a lot of the world's best coffee being grown. So when we look at parallels to the wine world, most of the best grape growing regions fall in that 30th to 50th parallel on either side of the equator. When it comes to coffee growing, those regions, the best regions for coffee growing, are found right on the equator and then up to and down to about the 20th parallel. So really interesting kind of the juxtaposition on where coffee is grown as opposed to where like the best grapes are grown for wine. A lot of people don't realize that when it comes to coffee, you've seen coffee beans before. A lot of you out there either, I'll bet a good majority of you are buying, if you're making coffee at home, you're buying already ground beans, or you're buying whole beans and grinding them fresh at home, which is the best way to do it. So you've seen what a coffee bean looks like, but you may not have ever thought about where it started and how it kind of got to the place that it is in. So coffee actually, it's a cherry, really. The best way to think of coffee fruit is to think about a cherry with a pit inside of it. So when you see the coffee growing on the coffee tree, it essentially is a little red berry. Fruit on the outside, definitely could be eaten, probably wouldn't recommend it. Very tart, very sour. On the inside, you've got a pit. So what we need to do is we need to find out how we get to that pit inside and get it to a point where we can roast it and ultimately brew our coffee with it. So a couple of different ways that can be done, and really the way that that's done will dictate flavor and structure of your coffee. So the reason that I really wanted to put this out there, guys, is this is going to be where we start really kind of honing in when you're going to either the grocery store, your local coffee shop, or going online to buy coffee. I want you guys to be able to pick out things that are going to help you find what coffee fits your flavor profile the best. And that really kind of, we can really start anywhere with that, but one of the things that if you're going to deep dive into the world of specialty coffees, you'll want to know, how was that coffee processed? So the two most important, or kind of most important, the two most well-known and that you're going to see the most are going to be natural versus washed. Natural versus washed. So what does that mean? So coffee's picked, right? We've got these little cherries, and we've got to get down to that core, that little pit on the inside, because ultimately that's our coffee bean. So let's talk about the natural way. That's going to be the easiest place to start. So natural really is kind of a lot like how it sounds, guys. It's very natural. The coffee's picked, it's laid out to dry in the sun. Now what happens, as you can imagine, with any other, kind of fruit that you may pick and lay out in the sun, it's going to start to, for lack of a better word, rot. Now there is probably a better word for that, and that would be ferment, which is a word that you guys are probably very familiar with, as this channel is mostly about fermented products. It's going to sit out and ferment. 10, 20, 30, 40 days, sit out in the sun and essentially rot that exterior fruit off of the bean. Now what that does is, with the natural process, that rotted fruit flesh essentially is going to impart flavor on the coffee bean. I really enjoy natural processed coffees myself because it adds this additional fruity character. It can add slightly funky aromas and flavors, but really gives it that kind of nice fruity flavor that's a little bit more beyond what you would expect with your kind of typical kind of cocoa and nuttiness and tobacco or whatever else you kind of expect, or those kind of more savory, more robust flavors with coffee. The natural process is going to give you more of those fruity characteristics. The other method would be the washed method. And essentially what that does is, instead of leaving those beans out to just kind of rot in the sun, they are being put through a process in which all that fruit is being extracted from the core on the inside, the bean, and once it's been extracted, they're then laid out to dry. So there's still a little bit of some material kind of left around there that will impart a slight characteristic to it, but really most of that fruit's been removed. Then they're laid out to dry, and at that point we're at the same place. We've got the dried bean with a little bit of stuff on the outside of it that's then kind of finally processed through, and we're left with a green, essentially the pit of this cherry, this green coffee bean. So that takes us to a point of roasting, which is really kind of the big one, in my opinion, for if you're starting to really get into coffee and you want to try and find how your coffee is going to, or kind of understand how a coffee might taste when you're going to pick it out at the store or wherever. It's that roast level. So you've got light to dark roast, and I mean, a lot of times you'll see extra dark roasts. So let's break that down a little bit, because I think that that's another place where when it comes to coffee, there's a little bit of a kind of a misnomer with the roast levels. So the way I like to think about it is, let's say for instance something like tuna. So if you're a big sushi fan or a big seafood fan, you'll know that you can get tuna in a couple of different ways. You can get your raw tuna, sashimi. You can get a kind of nice kind of ahi style sear on the outside where you cut into it. It's still mostly nice and raw on the inside, but you've got that nice little level there of sear, which adds a little bit more extra flavor. It gets that brown edge on it, has that Maillard reaction that takes place. And then if you grill it a little too long and you don't have any kind of that raw in the middle, you're really kind of left with a bit of a chewy, slightly flavorless, rubbery piece of tuna. That's kind of how I liken the roasting method for coffee. The lightest method is going to give you the lightest roast is going to give you the most pure form of what that coffee was intended to taste like. The further along that spectrum you go into those darker roasts, the more you're going to have essentially cooked out most of the flavor and nuance of that coffee, and you're just going to be left with those very roasty, toasty, savory, and a lot of times bitter flavor profiles. Really, somewhere right in the middle is the sweet spot, in my opinion. I say that middle ground is kind of king when it comes to roasting coffee. So I personally am always looking for a medium roast on the beans that I'm buying. Another really important thing that I'm looking for when I'm buying beans is the roast date. So coffee is essentially it's a perishable item. I actually don't know what the FDA approved definition for perishable is. I don't know if it means something that goes bad or something that just loses flavor over time, but coffee will lose flavor over time after it's been roasted. So you want to buy your coffee beans as freshly roasted as possible. If there's not a roasted on date on the bag, I would not buy that. So that's a really easy way to just eliminate a good majority of the coffee that's out there that's total crap, is that people aren't going to put the roasted by date on there if they know that they can't get a product on the shelves in a timely manner. So always look for bags that have roasted dates on them and try and buy within the last month. Is a pretty good spot. And then look for that roast level, because I would say medium is about where the best flavor profiles are going to be found with any coffee. Now, if you try coffee and you like darker roast, if you like roasted toasted flavors, then by all means go with that. But something else you want to think about when it comes to roast levels is going to be the caffeine level. We talked about this in my tea series. So something to think about when it comes to your coffee is the kind of a misnomer here is going to be the more a coffee is roasted, the more caffeine is being roasted out of that bean. A lot of people who try and, be big brawn, I like my coffee as dark as possible. I like it rich and robust and powerful, and it gives me a real strong caffeine buzz. That's not the case, guys. It really isn't. The actual biggest caffeine buzz you're going to get is going to be from lighter roasted coffees, because that caffeine has not been roasted out of the bean. You go to the grocery store, let's say, like Whole Foods, and they've got those big, they're full of coffee, the canister, you can see right in it, and you pull all your coffee out. A lot of people will look for the one that's like the most oily. Oh, that's nice and dark, that's robust, that's rich, it's gonna have a lot of caffeine, give me a good buzz in the morning. That oil that you can see on the exterior of the bean is all the flavor that's been roasted out of the bean. Actually buying coffee beans that have that oily exterior is you're leaving a lot of flavor on the table because they've been over roasted. So at this point, let's take a step back. We haven't gotten into origins yet, which is a big part of the video today, but let's talk about let's recap what we've talked about. So washed versus natural process, something you're going to want to look for. Washed process is essentially going to give you a cleaner, more vibrant expression of a certain bean. The natural process is going to give you a fruitier expression, a little bit more gritty, grimy, kind of sometimes a little funky expression of a bean. And it's going to be cool because I've actually got two of the same coffee from the same place, same roaster, same roast level. One is natural, one is washed. So we're gonna get into that today. So that's gonna be cool. Okay, processing, that's one, wash versus natural. Second is going to be roasted on date. Big one, guys. Make sure that you're buying coffee that's freshly roasted. And the third one is going to be that roast level. So light to dark, looking for that medium place is, in my opinion, kind of the sweet spot there. So up next, we're gonna move into different brewing methods, and that is going to make a big difference on your coffee overall flavor and mouthfeel. So let me pause it just a second here. I'm gonna get some items and we'll be right back. All right, well, time to get into brew methods. So you guys can see I've got a couple of different items here. Some of them may be familiar to you, some of them may not. But essentially these are the 3 brewing methods that I use the most. So let me start by saying one thing here just as an overall clarification. Everything that I talk about in this video one is going to be tilted a little bit towards my preference on how I like to drink coffee. Now, my preference is, I would say, if you've got spectrum of everyday coffee drinker all the way to I'm making coffee in competitions and my entire life is surrounded by coffee. I find myself probably in the middle ground of I really enjoy complex, flavorful, unique coffees, and I drink them regularly enough to where I want to make sure that what I'm drinking is a really good product, much like the wine that I'm consuming, the beer that I'm consuming, the tea that I'm brewing, all of that kind of stuff. I throw coffee right into that same category. So that's to give you an idea of what you can expect from me. If you are a little bit more towards your just kind of casual coffee drinker, you don't really care, then I'll still have some good stuff in here for you. And then those of you who are on the other end of the spectrum, this is probably all boring stuff to you because you know all this already. So having said that, with brewing methods, the most general one that everybody is probably used to is going to be a drip batch brewer. Batch brewers are great if you're wanting to make a lot of coffee at once, if you've got a big family, if you've got people in town that you need to make a lot of coffee for and you don't want to go through the whole rigmarole of everything multiple times. There are great batch brewers out there. I love my Bona Vita batch brewer. I'll link that up in the description of the video so that you can find that. So batch brewers are great for that, but I would say that at home, since it's mostly just me and my wife, I usually go with one of these more individualized methods. Things that you need, I've talked about it in my tea video, Bona Vita electric kettle, get one. Other thing you're gonna need are these other things that I've talked about in my tea video. Little small digital scale, definitely worth it, and handy dandy kitchen timer here. So those are the things that you need. In addition to coffee, grinders are a big kind of hot topic. I would say that, again, I think that you should always be buying your beans whole bean. I think that you're going to get the freshest expression out of your coffee if you're grinding it yourself at home right before you make it. There are cheap grinders out there that you could get at the grocery store, on Amazon, where you put the coffee in, you hold down a button until you decide that you think that it's at a good grind, and then you let it go. I personally have a burr grinder. I think that if you're going to be serious about coffee, you absolutely should maybe spend some money on getting a high quality grinder. They can be expensive. I'll link up the one that I have. I highly recommend it. It is a very key piece of my overall coffee setup, but there are some cheaper options out there if you're just wanting to kind of dip the toe into this new coffee world. So okay, so let's talk about different methods. I'm sure a lot of you know what this is. This is a French press. The thing about the French press is that it is a fully immersive brewing method. So what that means is essentially the coffee is being soaked in water for a select period of time and then being poured out. So I would say that with a full immersion brewing method, you're extracting more flavor, more body, and it's going to give you a more robust, more oily kind of coffee. So I usually will use the French press for my more robust expressions of coffee, something like say a Colombian coffee, and maybe in a slightly darker roast. I go with the French press. I would say, the majority, unless I'm brewing just a single cup, which we'll get to, the majority of my coffee brewing is being done in the Chemex. So Chemex is a glass brewing mechanism that was invented in Germany in 1941, and essentially what you do with this, if you're not aware, is you drop a filter down in here, fill it with your coffee beans, pour over your water, and the coffee will immediately start to drain out into the carafe here. So what that does is it just is the water is in contact with the coffee for a brief amount of time, extracts only the readily soluble materials that are inside the coffee, and it gives you a much cleaner, crisper, brighter expression of the coffee that you're drinking. So most of the coffee that I make is in a pour over method like the Chemex. Now, the one that I'm going to be brewing our coffee with today, and the one that I use, have been using quite a bit since my wife has been pregnant and it's just me drinking coffee, is the V60. So the V60 was invented in Japan, was released to the market in 2004, so relatively new brewing method for the coffee world, but the V60 has proved to be a very, very... I would say that it's definitely the most preferred method for high-end coffee snobs. In fact, the V60 has won the brewer who has used the V60 as their brewing method in the coffee brewing competition has won with the V60 like the last 5 out of 7 years, something like that. It is really, it's actually, as you can tell, very scientific. I don't want to get into it, but it is really kind of the best way to extract a very pure cup of coffee, especially in a single cup format. So I would say that there are many other ways, including espresso, which I'll touch on espresso at the very end. There are many other ways to brew coffee besides this, but I would say that these are definitely the most common place and for me the most used around my household. So, couple of rules when it comes to brewing coffee. We'll get into that and then we'll take another quick break and I'll bring out the coffee samples. Water temperature, not boiling. That's why you need an electric kettle. 205 degrees. Can be adjusted. I think that a lot of, people would say that if you're, a lot of very serious coffee drinkers would say that if you're not doing some tweaks and adjusting whenever you get a new bag of beans, that you're missing out on some potential there because different temperature, brewing temperatures, different ratios, different grind settings, all of those things can affect the outcome of the final cup. I actually have done this firsthand. I took a weekend-long coffee school in Dallas that taught me everything that I know now about coffee, and we did a lot of experimentation with the same exact bean, brewing it at different grind rates and different vessels with different brewing times, different temperatures, and I'm here to tell you guys that it does make a huge, huge difference. If you are going to sit down and get into coffee in a more nuanced way and really understand the complexities of coffee, especially when it comes to single origins and different varietals, you will come to realize that the way that you're brewing your coffee does make an ultimate flavor difference. So, all the things I'm about to tell you can definitely be tweaked, but this is the method that I have found is very consistent for me and the way that I brew the majority of my coffee. So 205 degrees. My grind setting, it depends on the vessel that I'm using. My burr grinder goes from 0 to 40, 0 being the finest grind, 40 being the most coarse grind. With my pour overs, this guy and the Chemex, I'm right in that about middle area, so about 22 is the level that I've got my grinder set to for that. For the French press, you want a little bit bit coarser of a grind so that when you go to press, it's not all compacted. The water can kind of go through those grounds a little better. So that's at about 32 on the coarse scale. And then the ratio that I like to use, again, as a standard benchmark is a 2-to-1 ratio, which is essentially for every 1 ounce of coffee that I am going to want to drink or that I'm going to want to brew, I use 2 grams of coffee. So 1 ounce of water to 2 grams of coffee. So usually if I'm brewing up like a Chemex, I'll go with 60. I'm usually doing about 60 grams of coffee grounds to 30 ounces of water. And that's where the scale comes into play. The timer comes into play because the best thing you always want to do when you're opening up a new bag, you want to time out your bloom. That's a little bit advanced for brewing, but essentially you want to pour just enough water on there to kind of soak the beans, let them bloom and release some gases and things like that, some volatile things for about 30 seconds to a minute, depending on how fresh the bag is, and then do your pour over at that point and let the coffee start to drain out. So that's a little bit more complex, as well as like overall timing of how long your brew should take. So not going to get into that at all. So all right, so that's that. Let's bring out some coffee samples and we'll get moving. All right, guys, I'm back here with the coffee now. So as you can see, I've got 3 cups in front of me, all brewed in my nice little glass coffee mug, so you can see the color. Not a big difference in the color, really. I would say middle one is probably a slight bit darker than the 2 on the bookends, but other than that, they almost have a very black tea kind of color to them, this nice kind of reddish brown color, and they're all, nice and light. So probably can't really see as well on camera as I can see here in person, but really this is not what you probably all might expect out of your coffee. You probably are used to it being nice and dark, can't really see through it, but this is what it looks like when you brew nice medium roasted coffee through something like a V60 that's going to give you a nice light medium bodied expression of the coffee with its most nuanced characteristics coming through. So let's talk a little bit about kind of coffee growing regions and what you can expect from different flavor profiles for those different areas. So what I've got here to start with is what in my opinion is about as basic, straightforward, classic coffee as it gets. This is from Honduras. Honduras, in my opinion, every Honduran coffee I've ever had, no matter how it's brewed, it really, like the overall flavor profile to me is coffee. So if you have in your mind, if you're like smelling a wine or you're eating something like a dense chocolate cake, or you're trying to pick up a overall coffee flavor or aroma in something else, this is probably what you're trying to pick up. It's a very generic coffee kind of flavor and aroma. I mean, that's really the only way I can describe it. It's coffee. I would say a step up from Honduran coffee is going to be Nicaraguan. So we're still kind of in that Central America area. Nicaraguan takes on a little bit more nuance, a little bit more complexity with some things like nuttiness, chocolate, tobacco, stuff like that. So I would say that in terms of overall cost, Honduran's going to be very cheap. Nicaraguan a slight step up from that, and then getting down into South America, really Colombian is where you really start to get into that place that's kind of, in my opinion, Colombia is kind of like a gateway into specialty coffee. It has some of those very kind of reminiscent, those flavors and aromas that you associate with coffee, chocolate and nuttiness and robustness, but in a very well balanced and a very well restrained kind of a way. I think Colombia is a well-known coffee region for good reason, and I really enjoy a good rich cup of Colombian roast. every once in a while. So to start with the, we'll get further along into it, but I want to go ahead and give the Honduran a shot here. So yeah, I mean, if you've ever been to like a friend's house where their parents are just like all day coffee drinkers, they've just constantly got a pot of coffee just sitting ready to go throughout the day, their house almost always will smell like this. It's just this classic, almost like Folgers-esque kind of aroma that you get that just is very reminiscent of coffee. So, it's very subtle cup. This is actually a coffee in which I would probably prefer to brew in the French press to try and extract as much out of it as possible. I don't think that the V60 was the appropriate brew method for this particular coffee. Right now, I'm really not getting much of anything beyond a slight little hint of almost like citrus in there, or even, I would say apple, some appley, citrusy kind of thing, but no real acidity with this coffee. Just that very kind of coffee flavor. This tastes to me like coffee that you would get out, that's the communal like coffee at like, you know, a symposium or at church or at, you know, a gathering somewhere at a conference center. That's what this coffee kind of tastes like to me. So moving from Central and South America, we talked early on about how Ethiopia is the home, kind of the home place of, or the birthplace of coffee. So I've got two Ethiopians here. I mean, I could have very easily brewed up, you know, 10 different cups to go through a bunch of different stuff, but essentially what I wanted to show was almost kind of polar opposites here. Something that's just very kind of blasé, a good cup of coffee, but very kind of crowd pleaser. This isn't going to offend anybody, but it's also not going to blow anybody's socks off kind of a thing, into what, in my opinion, are the best coffees. The best origin of coffee is Ethiopia. There are 2,000 to 3,000 different varietals that are being grown in Ethiopia. The amount of diversity that you can find in Ethiopia with coffee is insane, especially when you start getting into different wash processes like we're about to. But Ethiopian coffee definitely has a kind of an overall kind of flavor profile. And what that is higher acidity, more fruitiness, berries, raspberries, blueberries, that kind of thing, with some of that citrus, sometimes kind of tropical notes, floral aromas and flavors, but certainly not your average everyday cup of coffee. Ethiopia is where I have kind of really gravitated towards because of the complexity and the nuance and the uniqueness that you get out of Ethiopian coffees. And what we're about to see is going to be two different Ethiopian coffees that are different because of the wash process that we talked about earlier. Beyond Ethiopia, I would say another place that I absolutely love coffee from is Kenya, also an African coffee. That acidity really gets ratcheted up with Kenyan coffees, and if you guys know me, you know that I'm an acid head, so that's why Ethiopia and Kenya are really where I go. With Kenyan coffees, you get a lot of kind of tomato characteristics and an uptick in that floral as well. So Kenya is another cool place to check out for coffee. So what we're going to get into here is going to be I've got the washed is right here. Yes, the washed is right here and the natural is right here. And the reason I know this is because this natural has such a predominant blueberry raspberry component to it. And I absolutely freaking love it. So let's start with the washed here. Very smooth, very bright, very clean, a noticeable uptick in acidity, but honestly not like a crazy amount, because this Honduran, even though it is very kind of pedestrian, everyday kind of coffee, it did have a good little bit of kind of citrus and acidity to it, and I give all the credit to Apex for that. All of these coffees today, if I didn't mention that, are coming from Apex, which is based in Waco. It's my absolute bar none. Tried so many other roasters, and Apex continues to blow me away with the coffee every single time. I went to Baylor, I found out about Apex in Waco, so I know there's some bias there, but I'm telling you guys, I've tried coffee from all over the place, and Apex is continuing to put new coffee out that challenges my taste buds. It gets me excited about brewing a new cup of coffee in the morning. Really, really incredible stuff. So Apex, they ship to you. Go online, buy coffee from Apex. That's where I would start. We talked about roasting. We talked about roast dates. Every bag of coffee that you get from Apex, you're going to get it within a week or so, depending on how busy they are, a week or so of when it was roasted, and it's all going to be roasted with care so that you really can taste the coffee. So highly recommend those guys. So that's why I give a little bit of credit to I give all the credit to Apex on this Honduran being a little bit further than your pedestrian Honduran cup. It does have a little bit of citrus character going on with it. And a little bit of acidity. The acidity is a noticeable jump into the Ethiopian, which is why I love it. But this is very clean. I would say, it's got some berry, but almost a little bit more kind of chocolate to me, and very smooth with the natural. Like fruity berry. I mean, it's crazy. Like when I used to brew Apex at the office back in Dallas, my dad would come in and think that I had just made like a batch of blueberry pancakes, because these natural Ethiopian coffees always have this beautiful reminiscent blueberry, raspberry, strawberry kind of quality to them, in addition to florals, in addition to a slight bitter chocolate note. I would say that the acidity is actually higher on the natural, which, it can go both ways. A lot of times acidity could be higher on the washed, but if the natural was done in a really good process where that fruit really imparted its characteristic onto the bean, you can get a brighter acidity from the natural process, and I think that that's definitely the case here. So the last thing that I want to touch on, guys, real quick is really kind of, again, like I said, there's a ton of other origins that I did not touch on. I mean, I maybe only touched on about a third of the origins. I mean, Indonesia is a huge one that I didn't even touch on. I mean, I think that's where, like, Starbucks gets all of their coffee from. It's really quick turnover, lower altitude, whereas you've got much higher altitudes with these coffees here, and in particular the Ethiopian coffees. I think that these are like, 21 to 2,300 meters above sea level. So high altitude. Indonesia, you've got lower altitudes. They can turn the coffee over quicker, get it to Starbucks quicker, so that Starbucks can roast the shit out of it, because they know that people are they're gonna be throwing a lot of caramel and milk and all kinds of crap into it. So that's why I really don't like drinking. Personally, I don't like drinking Starbucks coffees, because I like to drink my coffee black. Starbucks over roasts all of their coffee because they know that people are gonna just fill it up with cream and sugar and caramel and mocha and peppermint and all that kind of jack. So that's neither here nor there. As far as espresso is concerned, so I know a lot of people walk into coffee shops and they get a little bit intimidated by the menu that they see. But essentially what all that comes down to is just a few. I mean, you can stay in your safe spot with 3 drinks, in my opinion, when you go in. So most of the drinks are, again, just espresso and milk. It's just the ratio that differs. So the smallest drink, you know, when you walk in and you see either macchiato or cortado on the menu, that's going to be your smallest drink. It's usually about a 3-ounce drink, so pretty quick, and it's about a 2-to-1 espresso to milk ratio. So definitely the strongest. I personally always go for the cappuccino. The cappuccino is the drink, or one of the drinks that's made in the coffee competition, and the reason being is that it takes a lot of skill to get the milk just right. So with a cappuccino, you're usually looking at about 6-ounce drink, and that's a 1-to-2 ratio, the 1 being the espresso, the 2 being the milk, and it should be a good combination of steamed and foamed milk. I know a lot of places you go to, you get a cappuccino like after dinner, it's like this much foam, and you're trying to you're tipping, waiting to get something other than foam that's all in your nose, or in my case, mustache. And then finally you get hit with like scalding hot coffee that was mixed with a little bit of milk, or espresso that was mixed with a little bit of milk. That's improper coffee milk technique. A cappuccino should be a nice integrated drink with the espresso, steamed milk, and just a slight bit of milk foam right on top. And that to me is like the perfect espresso drink. Above that, everybody knows a latte. Latte is going to be your bigger drink, usually about 10 ounces, and that's going to be a 1-to-3, with just a 1 being the espresso and 3, sometimes even more, of the steamed milk, which is why that the latte is going to be the most kind of smooth and creamy, with the least kind of power from that espresso. So look for those 3. Next time you're in a coffee shop, you don't know what to go for, look to those 3 if you want a big strong buzz with lots of espresso flavor, macchiato or cortado, and then you want to go for the cappuccino if you're looking for that middle ground, and the latte to really get a nice creamy and drink with a lot of volume, if you're one of those types that loves just to continue sipping and sipping and sipping. So that's that, guys. I think that's probably much longer than I was hoping for this to be, but hey, we had a lot to cover, and I think this will be kind of the definitive coffee guide video that I have on the site, so probably don't be looking out for any further coffee stuff. Just always refer back to this one for any of your coffee needs. So again, big shout out to Apex. They're the best. I would definitely go online and buy some coffee from those guys. And again, I'll have everything linked up in terms of my recommendations for products if you're going to really start to dig down deep into your coffee brewing at home. So I'm Mitchell Chirac for the Liquid Culture. Thanks for seeing you guys, or thanks for being here with me again, guys, and we'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.